Hello everyone, my name is Nadav Ben Yehuda. I'm 28 years old, I'm a student here in Israel, and I'm also a representative athlete in the fields of technical ice climbing and extreme altitude mountaineering. I lead specific projects all around the world for mountains above 7,000 meters and 8,000 meters globally. Among the other things that I do, I'm also a photographer and cinematographer, and usually all the photos and videos that I'm showing throughout my presentations are original work of mine. Between all the other organizations that I'm working with, especially here in Israel, I am the head of the Israeli Alpine community. I'm the official representative of Nepal's government here in Israel in the fields of technical rescues in the Himalayas and tourism for Israelis and other people throughout Nepal. And I also consult to many kinds of organizations, among them the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for those specific rescues all over the world and disaster areas that of course we don't really want them to happen. Well, I began my journey in the climbing world when I was about 16 years old. It was 2 years before I joined the Israeli Defense Forces, and I already knew that I'm about to become a combat soldier. This is why I started, participating and making those journeys all across the country and a little bit abroad too. At some point, I wanted to purchase myself some kinds of tools to get to some more interesting places all over Israel. I wanted to go caving, and I want to go, river crossings. So actually, the first part of my introduction with the climbing world was when I was actually going down. I didn't climb up. I was doing, abseiling and rappelling, and I really used those ropes in order to get to more unique places on the ground. After that, it was really natural, and I started to do my part as a rock climber, and I did it for several years, and I got to really high grades in those fields. When I was about to finish my service in one of the Israeli Special Forces, I started training myself for alpine climbing, technical ice climbing, winter ascents, and throughout the last few years, I'm really focusing on high altitude climbing, combining all the other techniques that I've took myself to study throughout the years. Now, I think it was about 6 years ago when I learned that in order to get to those places that I really wanted to go, I really needed to be like the center of those projects, because every time that I, looked for some kind of a climbing project or maybe a climbing course, every single time people ask me, how is that possible that a person who lives in the desert, who lives in Israel, can actually know how to ice climb? And this question is not really insulting, because this is the first and very, very specific question that you need to ask anyone who goes with you to the mountains. Because literally all of us, when you are going to the most violent places on planet Earth in really, really small teams, the first questions that one should ask are the questions about professionalism. We literally are all connected and hanged on the same ropes next to each other. Now, it took me a lot of time to try and shake this kind of assumption that Israeli people cannot climb because we don't have enough places to do our training over here in Israel. So this is why I spent so many years on my ice axes, on the ice, throughout the last decade, in order to let people understand that an ice climber is not determined by the country that he was born in, but actually with the amount of ice, if you want to call it, that is right inside his or hers heart. And I am sure that climbing will be a part of my life till my last day. And throughout the next questions, I will try to explain you guys and to expose you to the to some of the hazards and some of the more technical parts that I am experiencing in this beautiful world of climbing throughout the last 15 years. Some people ask me if there is a way to train for high altitude at lower altitudes. Like for a person like me, like an Israeli guy, can I train here at sea level before I can go, to big mountains, to high altitude mountains all over the world? Well, not really. The common approach is to move slowly up the mountain, about 300 meters a day maximum, but of course it's determined about the terrain and about the mountain that you are climbing. Spending your days at a higher altitude than where you sleep until your summit bid. The human body simply does not function well at high altitudes, and especially above 8,000 meters. As you go higher, the barometric pressure decreases, although the air still contains 21% of oxygen. Every breath contains less molecules of oxygen. The lower oxygen stimulates those chemoreceptors that initiate an increase in breathing, resulting in lowering the partial pressure of CO2 and hence more alkaline blood pH. The kidneys begin to unload bicarbonate to compensate. Though this adaptation can take many days, up to 80% occurs just in the first 48 to maybe 72 hours. There are many other physiologic changes going on. Among them, there is the stimulus of low oxygen to release the hormone of erythropoietin to stimulate more red blood cell production. A physiological and still acceptable form of blood doping that enhances endurance performance at low altitudes. We do not use when I'm talking about big mountains, this is not like the Tour de France. We're not taking medications in order to climb up the mountain. You have so many kinds of medicine in your bag just to get yourself alive if you get a really, really bad cerebral edema or lung edema, but you never use those things on the mountains in order to get to the summit. Adaptive changes are not always good for one's health. Some South American high altitude residents can have, what's called a chronic mountain sickness because they're living so hard throughout their lives. Their blood of those people over there, it can be up to 45 to 40, maybe I don't know, 90% of red blood cells. The increase of blood viscosity can sometimes associate pulmonary hypertension, can result in right heart failure. Now, you cannot do much to acclimatize at low altitudes, but there are companies that claim that they can help you acclimatize process through specially designed tents that stimulates the reduce of oxygen levels at higher elevations. Those things cost, I don't know, maybe a few thousands of dollars, and you can rate it on a weekly basis, but I've never used those systems myself. The only way that I acclimatize for high altitudes is when I go to the mountains. So in order to determine what are the effects of high altitude of the human body, we first need to determine what is high altitude. So altitude is defined on the following scales. We have like between 2,500 and 3,600 meters, which is considered high altitude. There is the very high altitude, which is between 3,600 meters and 5,400 meters, and we have the extremely high altitude, which is above 5,500 meters. Since few people have been to such altitude, it is very hard to know who may be affected. There are no specific factors such as age, sex, or physical condition that correlate with the susceptibility of to high altitude sickness. Some people get it and some people don't. And some people, are more susceptible than others. Most people can go up to about 2,500 meters, which is just below the line of high altitude with minimal effect. If you haven't been to high altitude before, it is very important to be cautious. If you have been at a high altitude before with no problems, you can probably return to that altitude without problems as long as you are properly acclimatized. So the major cause for altitude illness is going too high too fast. Given time, your body can adapt to the decrease of oxygen molecules at a specific altitude. This process, I think you already know about this one. It's called the acclimatization process, and generally takes between 1 to 3 days at that altitude. For example, if you hike at about 3,000 meters and then spend several days at that altitude, your body acclimatizes to about 3,000 meters. If you climb to, let's say, 4,000 meters, your body has to acclimatize once again. A number of changes take place in the body to allow it to operate with decreased oxygen. There is the depth of respiration increases. Every time that you breathe in, you breathe more. The pressure in the pulmonary arteries is increased also, forcing the blood into portions of lung to which normally not used during sea level breathing. Also, the body produces more red blood cells to carry oxygen. This is very common, and I'm sure that you've heard of it. The body also produces more particular enzyme that facilitates. And of course, the release of oxygen from the hemoglobin to the body tissues. Now, if we look at some of the more common high altitude sicknesses, we have three, let's say, major ones, because we do not have enough time to talk about all of them. The first one is acute mountain sickness. It's called the AMS. AMS is common at high altitudes. At elevations over 4,000 meters, 75% of the people will have mild symptoms. The occurrence of AMS depends upon the elevation, the rate of the ascent, the individual susceptibility. Many people will experience mild AMS, acute mountain sickness, during the acclimatization process. Symptoms usually start like about 12 to 24 hours after arrival at altitude and begin to decrease in severity at the third day. The symptoms of mild AMS are headache, dizziness, being tired, fatigue, shortness of breath, loss of appetite, nausea, disturbed sleep, and etc. etc. Symptoms tend to be worse at night when respiratory drive is decreased. Mild AMS does not interfere with normal activity, and symptoms generally are decreased within 2 to 4 days as the body acclimatizes. As long as the symptoms are mild and only, really like they're really bugging you, but they're not really making your body feel really, really bad, um, the ascent can continue at a moderate rate. When hiking, it is essential that you should communicate any symptoms of illness immediately to others in your team. AMS is considered to be a neurological problem caused by changes in the central nervous systems. It is basically a mild form of high altitude cerebral edema. Now, this one, the high altitude cerebral edema or HACE, it is the result of a swelling in the brain tissue from fluid leakage. Symptoms can include headache, loss of coordination, weakness, decreasing levels of consciousness, including disorientation, loss of memory, hallucinations, etc., etc. It generally occurs after a week or more at high altitude. Severe instances can lead to death, of course, if not treated quickly. Immediate descent is necessary and life-saving measure in these cases. There are some medications that may be prescribed for treatment in the field, but these require that you have a proper training in their use. Anyone suffering from HACE, which is again high altitude cerebral edema, must be evacuated to a medical facility for proper follow-up treatment. Now, as you understand, the HACE is a direct line of a really, really, really severe AMS. But there is a parallel line of another kind of high altitude sickness, which is the high altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE, if you like. HAPE results from fluid buildup in the lungs. The fluid in the lungs prevents effective oxygen exchange. As the condition becomes more severe, the level of oxygen in the bloodstream decreases, and this can lead to impaired cerebral function and death. Symptoms include shortness of breath, even at rest, tight, like a pain in the chest, fatigue, feeling of impending suffocation at night, weakness, and the persistence of a productive cough. You just cannot really get those fluids by coughing outside. It's inside your lungs. Now, there are some studies all around the world about who are the people that get the high altitude pulmonary edema. Because as you understood, the cerebral edema is a direct line of acute mountain sickness, but this one, the HAPE, is a completely different one. And a lot of people, researchers, they approach mountaineers all around the world to get them inside the database to understand who are the people that get this one, the pulmonary edema, and why other people don't get it. Now, I can tell you for sure that the person that will get a high altitude pulmonary edema probably will get also a cerebral edema, but it doesn't work on the contrary. This is why this one is really, really unique. There are anyone who's suffering from HAPE must be evacuated to medical facility for proper follow-up and treatment. And it's not like the cerebral edema. It's not really sure that if you will go down as fast as you can, all the fluids will go away from your lungs. This is why even after you are going down, you need to evacuate as fast as possible, probably by helicopter, in order to get to the hospital. I wish you all the best of luck through your studies and your researches, and I am sure that every and each and one of you cannot really be a physiotherapist or to study, because I know that these are very difficult studies. You cannot really be there if you don't really love what you're doing and really want to be there. In several aspects, it's just like climbing mountains. Best of luck. I love you all. See you later from Israel.